Institute of Technology. Some of you may be familiar with AFIT. I hear at least one of you has gone through the AFIT program. I did as well. That's been about 15 years ago, so a little dated. But AFIT is divided into two different sides, two distinct sides. One, you have the master's program that you can get in cost analysis or different degree granting programs, or you can do the continuing education side, which is the side that I'm on as an instructor. I teach cost analysis. There are a couple courses that I participate in, QMT 290 and QMT 490. Some of you may have heard of those courses, but those are courses for cost analysts at different levels within their careers. And so if you'd like more information on those, please let me know. I'll be glad to get you information, or you can go to our AFIT website and search all you want for either cost analysis courses or many of the other courses that we offer. So what I want to talk to you today about is the importance of cost analysis in the acquisition process. I'd like for this to be interactive, as Ben said, so if you have a question at any time along the presentation, please just let Ben know. He'll signify to me that we have a question, and we can start a discussion. So I encourage you to do that. It should last about 45 minutes or so, and hopefully we'll make it as fun as possible. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. This is an overview of what we're going to talk about today. We'll look at some recent DoD cost overruns, why cost analysis is so important in the military, in DoD, in the Air Force. We'll look at the definition of cost analysis. We'll then look at the importance of an entire life cycle cost, that being from cradle to grave of what something costs. We'll then take a look at a couple elements of a cost estimate or of a program. One being the work breakdown structure, and two being the technical and programmatic baseline. Two very important elements when we're talking cost analysis. We'll then shift gears and look at a relatively new idea, should cost. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll wrap up with some of my thoughts as well as the future of cost analysis as I see it. Okay, so why the big push for better cost analysis within DoD, within the Air Force? Well, if you look at some of the audits that have happened recently, the GAO audits, you may see that they've reported that there have been 74 non-McCurdy breaches since 1997, involving 47 different major defense acquisition programs. If you're not familiar with what a non-McCurdy breach is, essentially it involves overshooting your cost or overshooting your schedule by a certain amount. A non-McCurdy breach can be classified as either significant or critical. A significant non-McCurdy breach basically means you've overshot your schedule or your budget by 15% when compared to your current baseline. Or if you're looking at the original baseline for your program, you've overshot it by 30%. So if you've done either of one of those two things, it'll be considered a significant non-McCurdy breach. And if that's the case, then Congress will have to be notified, and there may be further actions from there. The other more serious breach, non-McCurdy breach, is called a critical breach. And this is an increase of 25% against your current baseline or 50% against the original baseline. If that's the case, and Congress already knows about it because it was originally a significant breach, but this is where program termination becomes possible. So that's essentially what non-McCurdy breaches are. 74 of them have happened since 1997, and multiple programs have been canceled. You can see the list of them here. The one at the very bottom, the BH-71 presidential helicopter replacement, that was canceled a few years ago. They are now trying to bring it back based on some more restrictive cost guidelines. So we'll have to see where that goes. But you can see no program is immune from being canceled due to problems that are happening with it. And we have our presidential helicopter that got canceled. So cost analysis, very important to get it right. These are just some of the factors that either in whole or in part contributed to each of those 74 breaches. You can see the fourth from the left, revised estimates. So revised estimates was one of the causes of each of these programs being breached. So again, this is why it's very significant to try to minimize this number so that we don't have programs being canceled in the future. So what is cost analysis? Well, essentially it's the process of collecting historical programmatic data over time, using that data to then develop different models for what something may cost, and then applying those models, using those models to then project the future cost of a program, process, task, what have you. So it's basically predicting the future based upon what has happened in the past. There are multiple steps in the cost estimating process. First, and what I feel is most important, is the definition and planning phase. This is essentially where you're defining your cost estimate, you're laying out all your ground rules and assumptions, you're defining the scope of the estimate, so how far are you going to go with actually estimating whatever you're estimating. So that's step one. Very important to get the groundwork right. Step two is data collection. This is where you're going to go out and pull all of your historical data that may be related to the program that you're estimating for now. Step three, you're then going to use that data to develop the models that you'll then use for estimate formulation for your current program that you're trying to estimate for. You'll incorporate inflation as well, because a dollar today is not the same as a dollar tomorrow. So you'll want to make sure you need to understand exactly how much you want to ask for based on the year that you're going to need those dollars in. Step four will be review and presentation. This is where we're going to go through and actually look at the estimate, do our cross checks, make sure everything is correct, but you'll also present it up your chain. You'll present it to your comptroller or to your commander, whatever. There's many levels up the chain that presentation will involve. So this is where that'll happen. Finally, step five, final documentation. You'll be documenting your program, your cost estimate, all along the way. But this step five is where you're going to put the final touches on your documentation. You're going to ensure everything is complete. This is where you may put your documentation in the form of what's known as a blue book, which is essentially a comprehensive cost estimate. It describes every element of your program as well as how you derived your costs for each of the programs. Some of you may have experience with blue books. Not every program uses them, but every program should use some form of a comprehensive cost estimate document, whatever you want to call it. Some characteristics of good cost estimates. I like to think there are three of them. One, the cost estimate is going to be accurate to the best of your knowledge. And you're going to do the best you possibly can to ensure that that cost best represents the program that you're estimating for. Two, the estimate is going to be comprehensive. What this means is you're estimating cradle to grave. You're going to start with your research and development costs, and you're going to go all the way out to your disposal costs. Cost estimates don't stop when the program goes into your operations and sustainment phase. So you need to estimate for those O&S costs as well as the disposal costs. When that airframe ages and it's no longer applicable to use in the environment today, we got to do something with it. Whether that means retire it at the boneyard or whatever, there's a cost associated with that. So we want to make sure we capture that up front so we know the entire life cycle cost of that program. Last, the cost estimate should be replicable and auditable. That basically means a competent cost analyst can go in, take a look at your documentation, everything that you wrote up about the program in order to come up with your cost estimate, and they should be able to recreate that estimate. There shouldn't be any holes, no confusion with how to do that. So that's what we mean by replicable and auditable. I think we covered this already, but again, it's important to capture the entire cost from cradle to grave, starting with your R&D costs all the way through the end of your disposal costs. Okay, so starting out with your work breakdown structure. Many of you are probably familiar with what a work breakdown structure is. It's essentially a product-oriented family tree. So it's a hierarchy, if you will. It's going to list all of the different elements of your program at various levels. So for instance, if you're doing a work breakdown structure on your vehicle, level 1 of the breakdown structure may just say vehicle, and then sub-levels 2 and 3 may be chassis, level 3 may be frame. Within frame, you may further break that down into welding components or bolts or what have you. But it's essentially a hierarchy that breaks your program down from the top level all the way down to its lowest levels. It's going to involve everything with the program. So everything that's part of your program is going to be captured in this work breakdown structure. It's going to involve hardware, your software, any services that are associated with your program, any data rights costs, whatever, as well as facilities. It may involve your military construction costs or what have you, but any facilities that are associated with your program, the costs have to be captured somewhere. So they're either going to be captured in someone else's cost estimate or they're going to be captured in yours. You just want to make sure you know where they're captured. That way, if you need to capture them, you can. And then the work breakdown structure is going to evolve as the system matures. So as you go through the different acquisition phases, your program is going to mature more and more, and you will evolve the work breakdown structure. You'll adapt it to whatever your program structure is at that time. So it's going to evolve. There are a couple guidance documents that you can reference or use when you're putting together your work breakdown structure. Data Item Management 81334D will outline the actual preparation of your contract work breakdown structure. So it's going to tell you exactly how to put your work breakdown structure together, how to fill out every single line in it. So you can go to this document, and it'll be your user's manual, if you will, for the work breakdown structure. The second document is Mill Standard 881C. This document essentially will give you a template for how to structure your work breakdown structure, depending on whatever type of program you're building, whether it be a Navy ship program or an aircraft program or a missile program or an electronic systems program. There are essentially, I believe it's 12 appendices within Mill Standard 881C that you can pick and choose from in order to lay out your program, lay out your WBS. So you're not doing this on your own. If you're charged with putting together a cost estimate and you're early in the program, the work breakdown structure has not been established, you can go to Mill Standard 881C, pull the applicable appendices that you need for your program, and start from there. So it's right there for you to help you out. You're not on your own doing this. Any questions so far, what we've talked about to include work breakdown structures?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
So is the WBS guidance, is it on e-publishing or some other website?
The guidance, if I heard the question right, where is the guidance? There are multiple places that each of these guidebooks are contained. So I can't specify one particular place. They are out there. I would guess e-publishing is definitely one one area where you can find either of these, but you can also Google them. Just Google either of these, either DI Management 81334D or the Mill Standard 881C. They'll come up all over the place. But it's going to be at various websites, to include different cost analysis websites in both the Air Force and DoD. AFCA website. It's really going to be all over there, and I would say the official, these change from time to time. They get updated from time to time. So I would recommend, you can certainly do a Google search for them, but you can go to either the SAF FMC, the cost site for the Air Force, or to the AFCA website. But you can find these many places throughout the web. Yes, sir.
Go ahead, Sergeant Lewis.
Thank you. Sir, as far as the work breakdown structure, it seems like there's a lot of different areas that you're communicating with. And now, the documents that you suggested or mentioned, do they tell us or guide us as far as who to contact in the big picture as far as pulling together working groups, or is that just something that experience is your guide
on that? I think I got the question. What I heard, please correct me if I'm wrong, was, do the guidance that I just referred to, the Mill Standard and the data item management documents, do they tell you who to reach out to and who to contact to formulate working groups, or how to do that? Was that the question?
Sure.
Okay. No, I think they may reference how to do it, but I don't think they go into detail with who you should contact or how to do that. Your program manager should have a pretty decent handle on aspects such as that, talking about the different working groups and such. The program manager is the one who's primarily going to be responsible for the work breakdown structure. But as a cost analyst, we're certainly responsible for going in and ensuring things are correct, and as appropriate as they can be for that particular program or cost estimate. So while I think that both of these documents will reference or briefly talk about different working groups, I think that's going to be more in the program management arena. So the courses that the program managers take, as well as all the resources that they have, I think that's going to be a better resource for telling you how these working groups get constructed and who you need to speak with. Okay. Okay. If there's no more questions, I'll go ahead and go to the next topic, the technical and programmatic baseline. Essentially, a technical and programmatic baseline is exactly what it says. It's going to be a baseline of your program that lists all of the different attributes that make up your program. This technical and programmatic baseline is what we as cost analysts will then use to construct our cost estimate for that program. It's going to be all the information, all the data that we use that we can then assign costs to that program. It is typically going to be found in your cost analysis requirements description, or many know it as a card, or it will be found in a card-like document. Not all programs have cards. There's not a requirement for a card in every program. It's really going to vary depending upon your ACAT level and your oversight level. So not all programs will have this thing called a card, but all programs will have something that is similar to a card, something that will lay out all of the parameters of your program that you can then use to construct your cost estimate against. If you are a cost estimator and your program does not have anything like this, you would want to speak with your program manager to try to get something like this established. A lot of the responsibility will fall on you sometimes as the cost estimator to construct one of these documents, but ultimately it's the program manager's responsibility to do it. So it'll probably be a joint effort between the program manager, you as the cost analyst, as well as the different functional experts within the program. So as I kind of was stating, what is your role as a cost analyst? What is our role as a cost analyst against the technical and programmatic baseline? We need to conduct our proper analysis against all of those elements that are contained in the technical and programmatic baseline to ensure a number of things are reasonable and as accurate as they possibly can be. One thing, there's going to be a bunch of sizing inputs that are contained within your baseline. How big something is, how much does it weigh, stuff like that. So it'll be our job as a cost analyst to go in based on all of the cost estimating relationships that we've come up with looking at prior programs to say, is this reasonable? They're saying they're going to have this much performance with their program, and their item weighs a certain amount. So based on history, can you have that much performance with something that weighs this certain amount? One of the examples that we get into in another class that we teach has to do with satellite programs. So that they talk about the weight of a satellite, and they talk about how strong the signal strength is. So that's one thing we talk about. Given a satellite that weighs a certain amount, can it actually put out a signal as strong as they're stating it is? So that's some of the things that you'll get into when you're as a cost analyst when we're analyzing the technical and programmatic baseline. We want to look at, has growth been applied to account for anticipated downstream changes? As we've seen with many, if not all, programs in DoD, change happens. We're not going to get it right the first time. Things are going to grow, things are going to happen. So we need to, based on history, we need to kind of account for unanticipated changes that are going to occur. So we need to make sure we're accounting for growth in our baseline. Looking at heritage input. Heritage has to do with how similar an item is to something else that came before it. So maybe its predecessor or what have you. So we want to make sure if the program manager is stating that, yeah, this item is very similar to the item that came before it, we just need to analyze that and make sure, because maybe it is, but maybe it's not. If it's not, that might involve a lot more research and development, a lot more risk in the program. So again, we're just making sure that we're doing the analysis to make sure that what's stated in the baseline is as correct as possible. All the risks, have they been reasonably determined? We want to make sure everything is captured in that technical and programmatic baseline. So hopefully we're not leaving anything out. And then looking at the schedule. Compared with history, is the schedule that program manager is proposing for this program, is it in line with history? Program manager obviously has a keen interest in ensuring his program succeeds, so he or she may have a very aggressive schedule that may or may not be realistic. So it's our job as cost analysts to take a look at the schedule that they put out and just ensure that, looking at history and what has happened in the past, is this schedule consistent with that. So we need to take a look at that as well. Yeah, cost estimators just responsible for ensuring that the baseline is reasonable as possible. Looking at some different cost estimating methodologies, how we actually come up with our cost estimates. Well, there's 5 primary ways that we can do it. First is the analogy method. Essentially, this can happen early in programs, has to do with a single data point. So we may not have a lot of information on the program that we're estimating for. We may just have one single data point. So for instance, you're estimating for a vehicle. You don't have a lot of historical vehicles to pull data from. You may only have one vehicle. This is what's going to be the analogy method. You're pulling data from that vehicle to estimate for your current program. So you're estimating for your current program with one data point. That's the first method. The second is the parametric method. This is where we have multiple data points. So again, you're estimating for the vehicle now. You're going to have multiple vehicles to pull data from in the past. You're going to use data from all those vehicles to come up with your cost estimating relationships. So it may be weight compared with performance or what have you. Software helps with establishing these cost estimating relationships as well. And you're not doing it on your own. There are various software programs that will do this for you and help you out. Third is the engineering method. This essentially is also known as the bottoms-up or grassroots methodology for coming up with a cost estimate. That's essentially looking at what does it take, what is the cost for every single element within your program. So you're starting at the lowest level possible, assigning cost to each of those levels, and then you're summing all of those costs to come at to arrive at an overall cost for your program. So that's engineering. It can be a little more time intensive, labor intensive, but if you don't have overarching costs or anything else to go on, this may be the methodology that you need to go with. Another method that we use, and this is sometimes later in programs, is actual cost. So if you can imagine that you've already started your program, maybe you're 75% of the way through your current program and you want to estimate the remaining 25%. Actual cost says that you will look at what are the costs to date, and then you'll extrapolate those costs to capture the remainder of the program. So say you've spent $1 million to date on your program. You're 75% of the way through. You might estimate that the remaining portion of your program is going to be roughly $250,000, $300,000, something like that. But essentially, you're looking at your actual costs to date on your current program, and you're extrapolating those amounts to come up with an estimate for the remainder of your program. That's what actual cost is. Finally, in the absence of anything else, you have expert opinion. This is where you're simply asking that technical expert, might be an engineer, logistician, whatever, you're going to ask them, what do you think this element costs? And based on their experience, their know-how, they're going to tell you it costs a certain amount. This is what expert opinion is. So expert opinion can be used as the estimate itself, but it can also be used as what we refer to as a cross-check. Maybe you came up with an estimate already using the analogy method. You don't know if that's a good estimate, if it was a good way to estimate the item. So then you want to try to come up with another way to estimate it. Expert opinion is one way to do that. You now have two ways to estimate something. You can compare the estimate that each of the ways comes up with just to make sure that they're in line with one another. If you come up with the same estimate, roughly the same estimate for using both methodologies, you can have fairly high confidence that your estimate is pretty accurate. If you come up with two totally separate numbers, then you may need to go back and take a look at what you've actually estimated, how you estimated it, because there might be more detail involved in order to actually come up with a most accurate estimate. Looking at the acquisition timeline, going through all the different milestones, this is just a guideline where you may see these different methodologies used. Again, you'll probably see analogy very early in a program because there's very little definition in most programs very early in the program. And then as you go through the program life cycle, you'll get into methodologies such as parametric, and then further along, maybe get into the engineering, and finally, as you get further and further along into your program, you'll start estimating based on actuals. And again, looking at the expert opinion at the very bottom, that can be used throughout the entire program life cycle, from cradle to grave. Any questions so far on methodologies, technical programmatic baseline, anything about those? Okay. All right, now to get in a hot topic of today. You may, hopefully, you've heard of this thing called should cost. Maybe not, depending on the functional area that you guys are in, what level. But should cost is definitely a hot topic today. It's formally been around for about 4 years or so, and we'll go through the history. We'll look at what it is and go through the history of how it came to be today, what it is. But essentially, when we're talking about this concept of will cost and should cost, it's essentially a two-tiered cost, funding, and management approach using two separate cost estimates. The will cost estimate is the first piece of it. This is essentially your non-admin cost estimate used for your programming and your budgeting purposes. This is going to be the cost estimate that accounts for all levels of risk. It's what you truly feel your program is going to cost, not looking at all the various efficiencies that may reduce your cost. So this is going to be the no kidding, this is what I think the program is going to cost, assuming that I don't achieve all these efficiencies that may happen. So that's your will cost estimate. Current guidance dictates that this is the estimate that we're going to use for our budgeting and programming purposes. So that's the will cost piece. The should cost piece is essentially the program manager estimate that takes into account all of the possible efficiencies and other cost-saving measures that he or she feel would be realistic given his program environment. Ideally, the program manager will attempt to execute to whatever cost estimate we come up with when we're talking should cost. And the should cost estimate was ultimately created to try to prevent the self-fulfilling prophecy of spending to your will cost estimate. Historically, what we've seen is if you have a will cost estimate of, say, $10 million, the program manager and contractor as well will tend to spend to that $10 million with minimal incentives to try to reduce that. So one of the things that should cost was created for was to try to minimize or to prevent actually spending to that $10 million. If your will cost estimate is $10 million and your should cost estimate is $9 million, you now have a new target to spend to try to achieve. So the thought behind this is that the program personnel, everything related to your program will now try to spend to $9 million rather than $10 million. This is the idea behind should cost. I think we covered the majority of this. The will cost estimate, it's going to aim to provide you enough money to execute your program under normal conditions. So it's not under ideal conditions or better than normal conditions. It's going to provide enough money to execute under normal conditions. It's going to assume all the different levels of risk that may be involved with your program. So you're going to apply dollars to those various amounts of risk. Current guidance states that the will cost estimate will usually be no less than the mean, which is typically 55 to 65% confidence level. What that means is that given a certain cost estimate or a certain amount of money, based on history, your program will be successful or will be executable given that budget 55 to 65% of the time. So that's essentially what the confidence level means. And then the will cost estimate is going to be prepared by an office that's typically outside of the program office chain of command. So again, you want that non-advocate, that independent look at what something is truly going to cost without the program manager's influence based on the fact that he or she wants this program to succeed. So they may reduce the cost estimate. So that's not what the will cost estimate is. It's an independent estimate on your program that ideally should truly represent what your program is going to cost. Okay, should cost, on the other hand...
We got a question real quick.
Sorry, question?
Yes, sir. This will cost, did it replace the ICE estimate?
No, that's the ICE, the independent cost estimate, is part. It's essentially it is the will cost. It's a part of the will cost. Historically, and as I said, the program office won't prepare the will cost estimate, but historically they have prepared a will cost estimate or a cost estimate, and then you have an independent organization such as AFCA that prepares the ICE that you're referring to, the independent cost estimate, but that is also known as a will cost estimate. So the ICE or any other estimate that AFCA produces, those all fall underneath the will cost estimate umbrella. Did that answer your question? Okay. I hope that it did. If I think the microphone was off. If it did not, please keep that, and we will readdress it here shortly. Okay. Okay. So looking at the should cost estimate, this estimate is going to incorporate what's known as success-oriented outcomes. It's going to incorporate all of the realistic efficiencies that program manager feels that he or she can incorporate into the program in order to reduce cost. So we'll look at this a little bit more here shortly in the example that we've got. But again, should cost is going to start from that will cost estimate. It can start from the will cost estimate, but it's going to incorporate many efficiencies, whatever the program manager feels is realistic, in order to try to reduce the cost, the overall life cycle cost of the program. Okay, so we discussed what should cost is. So what should cost is not. Okay, it's not arbitrary challenges by management just to reduce costs through straight line reductions, whether it be a specified percentage or a dollar value against the will cost estimate. So it's not your program manager or your commander saying, I want to reduce the cost of this program by 10% or by $10 million, regardless of how you do it. I want it reduced. That is not what should cost is. That may happen in program environments. I know it does happen sometimes, but that is something totally separate from what should cost is intended to be. Again, should cost is tied to specific efforts, lessons learned, or efficiencies that will ultimately drive the reduction in cost, not just an arbitrary, I want to reduce the cost by X% or X number of dollars. Should cost is not utilizing a lower confidence level from your will cost estimate range. So again, talking again about the estimating to the mean, the 55 to 65% confidence level. It's not saying, well, I want to make the estimate at the 25% confidence level. So essentially what you're doing, you're reducing your cost estimate down to a lower confidence level, basically saying, based on history, Given this amount of funding, your program will succeed 25% of the time. So you've essentially increased the risk into your program, but you reduced your cost. That is not what should cost is, again. It's not any items that are inconsistent with what your current program of record is. So looking at your card or what have you, it's not just arbitrarily changing elements that are no longer consistent with your program. That's not what should cost is. These last couple of points here, anything requiring significant investment for completion or anything requiring an increase to the budget. While the slide states that that is what should cost is not, I just want to add a caveat here that you need to do a cost-benefit analysis when you're coming up with the amount of money that you can save based on should cost. For instance, if you're looking at a particular effort and you think that if you invest $1 million into this program, additional dollars, invest $1 million additional dollars into this program, it can ultimately save you $5 million in the future. You do want to consider that for should cost. Now obviously there'll be other things that are involved. You'll have to run it up the chain, get different approvals and what have you. But I just say that because you want to make sure that while it states here that these are things that should cost is not, it doesn't rule them out. You still want to consider some investment into the program or an increase to your budget if the benefits are believed to outweigh that cost. Any questions so far on what we've talked about for should cost? Okay, so where did this idea of should cost come from? Well, many would argue that we've been doing it all along. The program manager has been incorporating should cost elements into their cost estimates all along. We are trying to be as efficient as possible all along. Well, that may or may not be true, but should cost officially was officially began back in about the middle of 2010, so roughly about 4 years ago. Some of you may be familiar with these better buying power memos and initiatives that have been floating around the last 4 years. June 2010 was the very first one that came out. It talked about implementing best practices, trying to do more without more, strengthen DoD's buying power, improving productivity, giving more value added to the warfighter. That's where this came from. In the face of shrinking budgets, how do we still maintain the same level of effort to the warfighter, or to give them more without more? That's where this came from. So that was June 2010, and then in November 2010, the implementation for this better buying power came out. So how are we going to actually achieve the concepts that we want to achieve? There were 7 different elements associated with this implementation memo. One of them that I want to highlight being control costs throughout the program life cycle, program or product life cycle. This is going to be where should cost comes into play. So again, this was November 2010. Then in August of 2011, we put out a memo that differentiated between this thing called should cost and this other element called affordability. The difference is this: affordability decisions tend to happen early in the life cycle of a program. Can we afford to pay for this much capability? Those are the types of questions that get asked. But again, it's early in a program before any budget is assigned. This is where as you may recall, we talked about the presidential helicopter being canceled and then it's being brought back. This is the principle that it's being brought back on. How much capability can we afford? What happened previously prior to it getting canceled, cost estimates tended to go up, but the capability, if you kind of look at the history of what capability they were asking, it kept going up and up and up and up, essentially maybe gold plating it. The presidential helicopter is being revived based on this affordability concept. So affordability happens early in the program. How much capability can we afford? Should cost tends to happen later on throughout a program, as the program has already started. And again, it talks about doing these stretch goals, incorporating efficiencies and such, reducing the cost that is expected for this program. Any questions regarding the difference between those two concepts?
When it comes to canceling a project, say like the helicopter, and bringing it back, when you do your new study of costs, do you factor in how much it costs to cancel the program in the first place?
Well, I believe I don't think you would bring that into play for for the new estimate for the program. You had your cost estimate previously, and cost to cancel that certainly were a part of it. So I don't think you would necessarily use those costs in your new program. Now, what you would do, this would tie into some type of disposal costs, or I think it's a contingency fund, if you will. How much contingency reserve or management reserve or whatever it's called, the amount that you would have to pay the contractor to us should your program cancel. You're going to owe a certain amount to a contractor, so you do need to factor that amount into your cost estimate, your new cost estimate. So when they're putting together the new presidential helo cost estimate, they will have some cost in there that will reflect cancellation. It won't necessarily be what the previous cost was, but it'll be how much will I have to pay the contractor based on how much they've invested into this termination cost. That's the term I'm looking for. How much will I have to pay the contractor to cancel this program? And then along with that, you'll assign a probability to that cost as best you can between you and the program manager. What's the probability that the program's going to cancel? So say the termination cost is $10 million. Well, the probability of cancellation is only 10%. So you may only assign a value of $1 million to termination costs. So hopefully I'm answering your question, but essentially you will have termination costs as part of your estimate, but it won't necessarily be the same as what the termination costs were previously on that same program. Does that answer what you were looking for? Okay, Ben, I saw your hand go up for a second. Anything more?
They cancel some of these programs and they bring them back to life, like the helicopter one. Do they pull those old cost estimate studies and kind of dust them off a little bit and maybe see where they might have went awry, or where they could use some good ideas from those?
Well, they certainly can. Those cost estimates would go in the historical database, and you can use those cost estimates along with others to come up with your current program. So when you're talking about dusting them off, yes, I think there is a certain element of dusting off that they'll do, which will then help you arrive at your current cost estimate, whether that be using the analogy method that we talked about previously. So essentially you're dusting off that old cost estimate. You're making a few changes based on the differences between that program and your current program, or just using that cost estimate, that data combined with a bunch of other programmatic data to arrive at your cost estimate. So I think there is some element of dusting off that happens, and then you will use that data, or you might adjust it to come up with your current cost estimate.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah, you're welcome, sir. Okay. All righty. Okay, so moving along. Better buying power continues to evolve. The concept, the techniques for implementation keeps evolving over time. It didn't just start in 2010 and then end there. The idea is to incorporate lessons learned into each future iteration of the better buying power concept. So back in November of 2012, we had what's known as Better Buying Power 2.0. It took into consideration all the lessons learned between 2010 and 2012 and incorporated into this new iteration. So what we have is Better Buying Power 2.0. And this is where they emphasized should cost management even more. I mean, we see in each iteration of Better Buying Power, they're really putting a focus on should cost based management. And we'll see in the example here shortly, it's proven to be successful. You know, any dollar that we save based on the should cost idea is considered success. So we'll see that shortly. But essentially, Better Buying Power 2.0 is just a refined edition of this concept. Okay, we've got an example here that kind of illustrates what the should cost, how to implement the should cost methodology, and how it really works. This example is showcased if you would go to the Better Buying Power website. You will see this example showcased on there. It's one of the success stories related to should cost management that the Air Force and that DoD has to date. So we knew quite a bit about this should cost example over the past couple of years, but one of the courses that I mentioned that we teach, QMT 490, happened back in March, so 3-4 months ago. We had the Chief Financial Officer for the F-22 program office come to be a guest speaker at our class, and she talked about this F-22 should cost example and provided a lot more details regarding all the details, all the effort that went into making should cost work. So it was very informative to me, and again, I would recommend if you, depending on your involvement in cost analysis, if you're a cost analyst, I would recommend looking at these offerings of QMT 490 and 290 and try to go to them because we get a current perspective from all of the senior cost estimators or senior financial managers in not only the Air Force but DoD as well. You'll get that perspective. You'll hear what's going on today regarding cost analysis. So I kind of got off track there, but I just wanted to say it's very important. We get a lot of these, a lot of this insight, a lot of these perspectives at these courses, to include this one right here. So essentially, what happened with the F-22? They implemented should cost based management, and they were able to come up with about a 15% savings efficiency in the short term, and then they estimate about a 12% efficiency in the long term. And this all occurred while they were doing their increment 3-2A negotiations. 3-2A basically had to do with software development, and I won't get into all the technical details, regarding that, because it really doesn't apply to what we're talking about, but it really has to do with software upgrades. They estimated that when you look at both the short term and the long term, it's about $32 million in projected savings. So, you know, while that's small pennies in the grand scheme of the DoD budget, it is something. I mean, it's $32 million. So, and as we'll see shortly, any dollar saved based on should cost-based management is considered a success. This one is certainly one of them. Okay. Okay, yeah, software only upgrade includes these different elements. Some of you may have worked with these different technical elements in the past: combat ID, electronic protection, Link 16, stuff like that. But that's essentially what this increment was made up of. Okay, there were 4 primary steps that the F-22 program office took in order to develop their should cost estimate strategy. Step 1 was data gathering. Step 2, they actually took a look at the data and developed their own model, their should cost model, what they thought the 32A and subsequent increments should cost. They then did some data analysis to include some cross checks. They basically asked the question, what they did in the model development stage, was it accurate? Do other estimates support what they found? So that's what they did in the data analysis phase. And finally, they presented the results and they implemented what they found, to include getting the contractor to buy in. We'll go into each of these steps here shortly, but this is the overview of the 4 steps that they went through in order to come up with their should cost. So step 1, essentially what they did, they met with the contractor that was going to be the primary contractor for increment 32A. They determined what the contractor's processes were, you know, how they were actually going to be performing their work, and then they came up with a cost estimate based on this meeting, what the contractor said, how they said they were going to be conducting their work. So they came up with a cost estimate. This might be the will cost, if you will. So that's step 1. Step 2, they then looked at that will cost and they said, well, how can we come up with efficiencies? How can we do things better? How do we want to recommend to the contractor that they do things better? That is what they did here in step 2, developing the model, massaging the data inputs. So they started with a baseline model. They then came up with a should cost model, and then they took a look and researched the various differences between the 2 models, the will cost, if you will, and the should cost. They start focusing on those different areas. So then they came up with their should cost estimate, and this, the step 3, data analysis, this is where they started using all the different methodologies to come up with their cross checks. They did various things such as bottoms up or engineering methodologies. They used that. Parametric modeling, top down or analogy. They used, I believe they used them all in order to come up with cross checks to just determine, is what we came up with in step 2 correct and as accurate as possibly can be. And then step 4, this is where they briefed the results, presented everything to whoever it needed to present it to, and then started working on actually making their analysis work, implementing it into the program. So you can see here their baseline cost or their will cost was roughly $212 million. And then after you factor in all the efficiencies and all the cost reductions, they can get it down to about $180 million. Cost savings of $32 million, roughly 27% of the entire program. What they found is they categorized it into short-term savings and long-term savings. The short-term savings were things that they could incorporate into their current contract, what they were currently working on. And then the long-term savings could not necessarily be implemented into the current contract, but it would require certain steps. The contractor would have to change their processes, improve their processes in order to come up with these more efficient ways of doing things in order to reduce cost. So it's going to require contractor buy-in in order to achieve this 12% additional long-term reduction. This is just a breakout looking at the 12% to the 27%, the different savings that they saved in, different things such as restructuring their organization, changing how the workload effort is distributed, looking at productivity, and then process improvements as well. Again, changing processes and changing the ways, recommending ways that the contractor can do business differently. The contractor nor do we always have the right answers up front. So what they did here is that they found that there were just better ways that they could recommend that the contractor conduct themselves, and if they implement those recommendations, we felt they could reduce our costs by a certain amount. And this is the breakout, the rough breakout of how they felt those costs can be reduced. This is just a waterfall view of looking at the proposal baseline and then decrementing the different efficiencies that occur. That 15% in the short term or the medium term, short term, and then 12% in the longer term. What they also found was there was an additional 18% or so that they could save in addition to the should cost estimate that they had already come up with. The 18% would be based really on restructuring the rates that the contractor used, any G&A, general and administrative savings that could happen, any proposal prep savings that could possibly be saved upon in the future. But again, these amounts are outside of the program office control, so they'll have to end up recommending some of these ideas or these efficiency measures up the chain, so outside their program. If their ideas are adopted outside the program, they believe they can save an additional 18% based on these three areas, among others. So in summary, this should cost effort has been deemed a wide success, both within the Air Force community, the F-22 community, as well as the DoD community. As I stated, it's highlighted and showcased on the Better Buying Power website, and you'll also see it, I believe, in various audits that have been done. They talk about this as well. It's a success. One of the things about this, and I'm wondering if it captures it here. I think it might be the next slide. Lessons learned. Let me see here. Yeah, lessons learned. So the program F-22 program office came back and said, based on the should cost effort that they did, here's what we learned. Here's how we think we can do things better in the future. Here's how we can truly make this should cost idea be executed as best as possible. One thing is that everybody, all players must be involved. It must be a coordinated effort between both our internal program managers, all the program management team, as well as to include our cost analysis team, contracting team, as well as on the industry side of the house, the contractor. Everybody has to work hand in hand in order to make this happen, in order to be successful at implementing these should cost initiatives. Also, they thought that it's good to ensure you have a multifunctional team of technical experts involved in reviewing these contractor processes. So you're bringing everybody to the table. All the experts are taking a look at the contractor's processes to make sure they're as efficient as possible. And then lastly, they stated the cost savings will not be realized if the initiatives are not incorporated into future contracts. So while it's all good to come up with these should cost ideas now, it's not going to do any good if none of these ideas are incorporated into future contracts. In order to achieve those savings, it has to be put to use. So they stated that contractor buy-in, actually getting the excuse me, the other half of the agreement, the contractor, getting them on board, getting them bought into what you're doing, because that's truly how we will be able to achieve these should cost savings. It's got to be a concerted effort both on the government side and the contractor side. Okay, so where are we going with better buying power? Well, there's a new iteration that's in the works. It's going to be titled 3.0. It's going to take a look at all the experience, all the lessons learned that we've recognized to date, and it's going to roll those into this new iteration of 3.0. Based on what I've seen so far, it's going to look similar to what we've seen in the past with previous iterations of better buying power, but it'll be tweaked a little bit just based on the lessons learned that we've seen to date. Certain things it'll focus on: rapid prototyping, actually getting the product out to the field quicker, better ways of doing that. Transparency, being more open to contractors. What we're finding is that in the past, I think we've been a little reluctant to share data with contractors for whatever reason. We feel they might get one up on us or what have you. But what the data and what history is showing is that more benefits can be gained by being open or completely transparent with the contractor rather than being closed off from them. So there's going to be guidance related to that in this new iteration. And then different ways of doing, better ways of doing budget drills. As many of you have probably seen, if you're in the budget process, you get many what-if drills, or some of your time may be spent on crunching the numbers. So what we're trying to do, what Better Buying Power will look at, is more efficient ways of making sure your time is used as best as possible. So guidance should be coming out related to that as well. As I stated a few times, looking at should cost, how do we know it's successful? Well, any dollar saved compared to the dollar over and above the dollar that you spend to achieve that savings is considered success. That means a small number of programs or contracts executing below their stated will cost budget each year is going to be a success, even if it's a very small number. Again, we're looking at the overall cost versus benefit here. If we're saving dollars compared to the amount that it takes to save those dollars, it's considered a success. Another way to ensure that it's successful is to try to provide incentives for the contractors. How can industry succeed in this environment? Well, you can tie their performance to possibly a higher profit. I know a lot of these ideas aren't completely fleshed out yet. They're trying to determine how are we actually going to do this. But the idea is that try to get the contractor to benefit from this as well, so they can help us reduce our costs while at the same time they're going to get a benefit from it as well. Maybe through follow-on contracts, maybe through higher profit, what have you. And then another related point here is that so programs won't face cancellation based on whatever reason, the bad cost estimates that we've done or what have you. because nobody wins if a program gets canceled. We don't win because we've wasted dollars throwing it into the program. The contractor doesn't win because now they no longer have that program to work on. They're not getting our funding for that program, so nobody wins. So trying to find good ways, better ways to ensure that not only we benefit, but industry or the contractor will benefit as well. Just some cost estimating challenges. As you'll see, if you get involved with cost analysis, there's always the lack of data. We've been doing cost estimates for years, but for whatever reason, maybe it's a lack of documentation, maybe it's a lack of the system actually holding all of this data. For whatever reason, you will always hear cost analysts talk about a lack of data. They'd like to perform a cost estimate on this program, but there's no data to support it. You'll always hear that. So that's a constant challenge for cost estimators. We also see it is difficult to quantify various alternatives. And cost analysis, like many other things, is not easy. It's a guessing game sometimes. The only thing we can do is be as objective as possible, looking at history and using history to try to project our program. So we can only do that the best we can, but it doesn't relinquish the fact that it will be difficult to quantify various alternatives for our programs. And then historically, what we've seen is there have been a lack of training or education for cost analysis. I think just recently we started seeing a bigger push for cost analysis. You can see that through the new emphasis on certifications, whether it be the DWIA, the Defense Acquisition and Workforce Improvement Act, CE being cost estimating. There's an actual cost estimating specialty track that'll give you certification in cost estimating. We didn't have that before. It used to be APDP FM, or financial management certification, that did not distinguish between cost and budget. I've seen both tracks. I got certified in APDP FM, and now having to go through and get the DWIA CE. You'll see more emphasis with the AFIT program, the Cost Analysis Master's program. I went through it 15 years ago. One of your students there just recently went through it, I believe. But you're probably going to see more emphasis there. I think as far as the future, I think you're going to see a high demand for cost analysts. So for job security purposes, if you definitely want your job here in DoD, I would recommend figuring out this big amorphous that we call cost analysis. If you can become good at it, if you can become an expert at it, you're going to be in high demand. We're seeing now that there are many positions, many cost analysis positions within DoD that can't be filled simply because